must never forget that the Roman Catholic Church was involved in slavery, and they have apologized for it. We must never forget that the Church of England was involved in slavery, and they have apologized for it, using the Bible, theology. We must never forget that the Roman Catholic Church was involved in slavery, and they have apologized for it. We must never forget that the Church of England was involved in slavery, and they have apologized for it, using the Bible, theology.
The Roman Catholic Church was deeply involved in slavery, not just spiritually or morally, but also politically, economically, and culturally. It sanctioned slavery through papal decrees. It blessed and legitimized colonial empires that depended on enslaved labor. And it even owned enslaved people directly, especially through religious orders like the Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans. Church-run missions in the Americas and Africa often relied on slave labor. Some priests baptized enslaved people, but still treated them as property. Bishops and popes were sometimes silent or complicit, and in many cases, they actively defended the system, especially when it protected church interests. Even when some clergy spoke out against the abuse of slaves, they rarely condemned slavery itself. That distinction allowed the church to maintain moral authority while still benefiting from the system. So yes, the church's involvement was not just surface level. It was deeply woven into the very structure and expansion of European imperialism and slavery for centuries. The church's endorsement of slavery started early, but it intensified during the Age of Exploration. When Spain and Portugal began colonizing Africa, the Americas, and parts of Asia, the church acted as a spiritual partner to these empires. Popes gave their blessings to these ventures through doctrines like the doctrine of discovery, which basically said that Christian nations had the right to conquer and convert non-Christian lands and enslave the people if needed. In Latin America, Catholic missions often worked hand in hand with colonial authorities. Indigenous people were forced into systems like the encomienda, which wasn't technically called slavery, but it was slavery in practice. Many missionaries believed they were saving souls by converting and controlling native populations, even if it meant using forced labor. Now, in Africa, Catholic priests weren't always the ones capturing or selling people, but they rarely condemned it. In fact, in places like Angola or Congo, which were Portuguese colonies, there were missions funded in part by profits from the slave trade. And when Africans were enslaved and brought to the Americas, priests would baptize them and perform religious rites, without questioning the system that tore them from their homelands. Even in the United States, Catholic institutions owned enslaved people. For example, in the early 1800s, the Jesuits sold over 200 enslaved men, women, and children to help keep Georgetown University financially afloat. That was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of wealth building. It wasn't until the late 1800s that church leaders seriously began to change course. And even then, it was slow, cautious, and often politically motivated. Full public apologies didn't come until the late 20th century. Many Catholic institutions in the Americas, especially in the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean, were built with wealth directly or indirectly tied to slavery. That includes churches, schools, hospitals, and universities. Some of these institutions still carry the names of slave-owning bishops, priests, or benefactors. In recent years, some have started facing that history. One of the biggest examples is Georgetown University, which, as I mentioned, was built partly on the sale of enslaved people in 1838. In 2016, Georgetown publicly acknowledged this and offered a formal apology. They also renamed buildings, offered admissions preferences to descendants of the enslaved, and started a fund for reconciliation work. But even that stirred debate. Some descendants felt the response didn't go far enough. The Jesuits as a whole have also begun reparations efforts. They've pledged $100 million toward programs for descendants of the enslaved, working with groups like the GU-272, descendants of the 272 people sold to save Georgetown. It's a start, but the healing process is still unfolding, and many other Catholic institutions have yet to reckon with their own ties. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the process is even slower. Some missions that enslaved indigenous and African people are now historical monuments, but without much public acknowledgement of the suffering that happened there. And in Africa, the church's historical silence on slavery is part of a bigger story of how it often stood with colonial powers instead of native populations. So even though the church today says it opposes racism and supports human dignity, the ghost of slavery still lingers in buildings, in records, in family histories, and in the structure of wealth and power. The Catholic Church didn't just benefit from slavery, it helped build the moral and spiritual framework that made it seem acceptable. Let's start with the idea of just slavery. For centuries, Catholic theology taught that slavery could be acceptable under certain conditions, like if someone was captured in a just war, or if they were a non-Christian. The church saw this as a way to convert and save people's souls, even though their bodies were in chains. Then there were the papal bulls I mentioned earlier, especially Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex. These documents, issued in the 1450s, gave Portugal permission to enslave Africans and Muslims as part of their Christian mission. The reasoning was that since they were infidels or non-Christians, they could be enslaved for the sake of spreading the faith. That language, framing slavery as a tool of evangelization, laid a dangerous foundation. In practice, this theology became a kind of spiritual cover for economic exploitation. Colonizers could tell themselves they were civilizing or converting people, even while working them to death. Priests and missionaries often turned a blind eye, or worse, gave blessings before slave ships sailed, or when plantations were being dedicated. Now, when some enslaved people converted to Catholicism, they were often still seen as property. Baptism didn't mean freedom. The church rarely challenged that contradiction. Instead, enslaved people were taught to accept suffering as part of God's will, another theological tool used to keep them obedient and hopeful for the afterlife, rather than justice on earth. Even canon law allowed slavery well into the modern era. And while a few brave voices in the church condemned it, they were usually in the minority and often ignored. What's striking is how long it took for the church to shift. The first strong papal condemnation of the slave trade didn't come until 1839, and even that was carefully worded, not a full rejection of slavery itself. That left Catholic slaveholders, especially in places like Louisiana and Brazil, plenty of room to keep going. So why and how did slave owners get Africans to accept Catholicism? Let's start with the why. Slave owners and missionaries believed that converting Africans would civilize them. They saw Catholicism not just as a religion, but as part of European identity and control. Baptizing someone wasn't only about their soul, it was also a way to make them more obedient, easier to manage, and cut off from their own roots. Now for the how, and this is where it gets layered. Conversion wasn't always forced in the sense of a whip at the altar, but it was deeply coerced. Enslaved Africans were often denied their traditional practices. Drums, dances, and languages were banned. Catholic instruction was pushed hard, especially in places like Brazil, the Caribbean, and Louisiana, where priests taught the catechism, baptized people, and held mass on plantations. Many enslaved people adopted Catholicism outwardly, but blended it with African beliefs, like honoring ancestors, spirits, or using rituals behind closed doors. This is how we got religions like Vodou in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, and Santeria in Cuba. They look Catholic on the surface, with saints and rosaries, but underneath, they carry powerful African spiritual traditions. So Africans didn't just accept Catholicism, they survived it, transformed it, and made it their own, even under brutal conditions. Some did come to genuinely believe, while others used it as a shield, something to help them navigate a world that was constantly stripping them of power. Before they were enslaved, Africans had deeply rooted religions, rich in ceremony, ancestors, deities, and respect for nature. These weren't primitive, as colonizers claimed. They were complex, philosophical, and tied to every part of life: birth, death, healing, justice, community. When enslaved people were brought to the Americas, colonizers tried to strip all of that away, ban their rituals, punish them for speaking their languages, and replace their gods with European saints. But Africans didn't let go easily. Instead, they got creative. In Haiti, for example, African spiritual systems like Vodun or Vodou fused with Catholicism. So when enslaved Haitians were told to pray to St. Peter or St. Barbara, they secretly honored their own deities like Papa Legba or Ogun, using the saints as a cover. These deities, or Liloa, are spirits that represent everything from war and protection to fertility and the crossroads. Vodou isn't devil worship. It's resistance disguised as worship. In Brazil, Catholicism blended with Yoruba beliefs, giving rise to candomblé. The Orixas, African deities, were mapped onto Catholic saints.